Now, the history of our divine office is quite interesting, I think. Remember, at the end of the 19th century, our German sisters came over from Germany, expelled by Bismarck. So the office at that time was chanted one day in German and the next day in English. Just like our Houston sisters, Vietnamese, chant their office one day in English and the next day in Vietnamese. So then later on, we began to use this little office book, the Blessed Virgin Mary office book. Now this is an interesting book because on one side the office is in English and the other side it's in Latin. So we chanted it in Latin, but of course we knew what we were singing because the translation was right there next to it, so that helped a lot. The one that helped us the most with this Latin chanting was Sister Frances Henry, and Father Jabot was a Benedictine monk. Now this was an interesting story from Sister Estelle. I didn't realize our community was that large, that the senior sisters prayed in St. Mary's Chapel and the sisters in formation prayed in St. Francis Chapel. Now the two of them helped out in both situations, but Sister Estelle remembers that Sister Frances Henry was up in the choir loft beating out the rhythm of the chant while Father Jabot was down in the the annex, or the place of the chapel, helping out the sisters chant in rhythm in better time. So that helped them a lot. Oh, by the way, she said this was the time when we put the cantors in the middle of the aisle sitting on stools, if you remember those days. Then someplace along the way, this was about in the 60s, early 60s, we changed to a short breviary. Now, we did not have this breviary too long because it says in the front, Sister Eileen Grace was the novice directress at the time, used until 1972. So that was the time that we used that book, all in English. Then, a little later, we had another book, not for very long, which was called Prayer for Christians. Remember, our present one is called Christian Prayer, but this one's called Prayer for Christians. And this one says that we used it only until 1978. So that was kind of this book. And of course, now our present book that we use now is also being revised, and we're expecting maybe in 3 or 4 years to hear more about the revisions and get a new book from there. But I wanted you to notice the difference in the books. You notice as the years went by, each book got a little bigger, a little fatter, and more extensive in style.
We pray the hinge prayers, the morning prayer and the evening prayer. So we're different in that those are the 2 hours of, for the most part, those are the 2 hours that are prayed. Whereas in the contemplative monastic life, they would pray all of the hours of the day, mid-morning and mid-afternoon and so on. However, in a way, we have our infirm sisters who do pray the midday prayer or mid-morning prayer. And then in some of the formative experiences, we have novices who pray night prayer, or for special programs or special retreats, we have groups that will pray extra hours of the day. And of course, an individual can pray any hours of the day that they would desire.
The suggestion of praying other hours of the divine office privately points to the importance of one's personal life of prayer. This same suggestion was given for a number of the devotions of the community that gradually shifted from public to private devotions. However, there are several devotions that remain semi-public: the Franciscan Crown, the Infant of Prague, and the Sacred Heart. Mentioned the devotions of the community, and in particular she mentioned the devotion to the Infant of Prague, which we bring out that statue as we did yesterday on the 25th of every month to pray for vocations. But then we also have devotions to the Sacred Heart and various other devotions that the sisters have mentioned. Do you know anything about the origin of some of those devotions of our community?
Well, I did a little sleuthing and a little research to answer that one, especially on the Infant of Prague. What I found is that we have Mother Odilia to really thank for the devotion to the infant, even before the Giebelhausen sisters came from Germany, who brought the devotion to us. Antigo was Mother Odilia's first mission, and when she arrived at the mission, There was a statue of the Infant of Prague standing outside the church, and to her it seemed to warmly greet her, and she had a devotion ever since that time. There's lots of history related to the infant, but we're not going to go into that. But eventually, when the Giebelhausen German sisters came, their foundresses had been trained by the sisters in Brixen, the Franciscan sisters. Their foundress had a special devotion also to the Infant of Prague and always had a statue with her and believed so strongly in that infant that I believe we got it very much so from the Giebelhausen sisters. And then on January 25th, 1917, the tradition of dedicating the 25th of each month to the Infant of Prague for our vocations was inaugurated by Mother Euphrosyne, and she wrote, "Dear sisters, last month we have begun to devote the 25th of each month to the special veneration of the Divine Infant for the purpose of obtaining good candidates. We offer Holy Mass and Communion and all our prayers and works of the day for that intention, and in the evening we have a procession through the halls, the statue of the infant being carried by a candidate."
Now, we were just at Clark's Mills yesterday doing some filming for this, and there's the big placard there next to the St. Francis statue about how it was on that Feast of the Sacred Heart, June 5th, that Teresa Gromlich came to Clark's Mills. And so is that where the connection to the Sacred Heart comes from, or is that a little bit different?
I think when they established their community, it was more so the devotion to the Sacred Heart that was brought up by the Precious Blood Sisters.
Okay.
Because they had such a devotion to the heart of Christ, the blood of Christ, that became part of the practice. Also, when the German sisters came over, they brought pictures, and we have the paintings in our heritage room. They brought paintings of the Sacred Heart, both Mary and Christ. And that was a very established devotion for them already then,
Sure.
and has continued since that time. But I remember changes in our own community with one of our, when we were looking at changing our constitutions, and that we were told that we had too many other prayers that we were saying, adding on, adding on, adding on. And so we were asked to cut back on some of those prayers that we did. So instead of those maintaining themselves as communal prayers, they became private prayers for people to say. So we have like our prayer manual, and people can continue to say some of those extra litanies and novenas, etc. But we are blessed in that every week we have benediction from morning until afternoon, and we have benediction on the first Sunday of every month. So we continue some of those early practices of prayer before the Blessed Sacrament that were so important.
I consider simplicity to be fundamental to the community spirituality, in that God is our center. Franciscans, but God is my God and my all. We're loyal to the Church and guided by her, but we're also free to form our own personal relationships with Jesus through private devotions, in addition to the liturgy of the hours and the liturgy of the Mass. So I just think, keep it simple.